Before we begin, let me make one thing very clear. This talk is not a lecture designed to condemn anyone, nor is it a practical guide about how to defeat difficult people in relationships. That is not the purpose. The purpose of this lecture is much simpler, yet far more unsettling. It is to help us recognize that the fractures we repeatedly experience in human relationships rarely come from personality alone. More often, they arise from structures, psychological structures formed long before we were capable of choosing them. In everyday life, most of us have encountered people who seem to operate in a strangely indirect way. They rarely confront issues directly. Instead, messages travel through intermediaries. Conversations occur behind closed doors. And when tension escalates, somehow, the person at the center of the conflict disappears from the scene. When we observe this pattern, our instinctive question is usually moral. We ask, why does this person behave like that? Isn't that simply a character problem? But philosophy and psychology tend to ask a different question, a more unsettling one. Instead of asking what kind of person someone is, they ask, when did this person first learn that? Expressing their emotions directly was unsafe. This lecture series explores adult relationships by traveling backward to the emotional world of childhood, because the way we relate to others as adults is rarely the result of conscious strategy. It is more often the repetition of emotional habits learned in early life. Today we focus on a particular question. What happens to a child who grows up in an environment where expressing emotions is discouraged or even forbidden? To illuminate this pattern, I want to borrow an unexpected insight from an ancient spiritual text, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This text is usually understood as a guide to the afterlife. But if we read it carefully, we discover something far more psychologically relevant. It says, the mind that is not recognized will repeat the same visions again and again. This statement is not only about death. It describes a fundamental law of human psychology. What is not consciously recognized does not disappear. It simply returns in another form. And this is precisely what happens in many human relationships. The first lesson: don't cry. Let us begin with a simple scene from childhood. A child begins to cry. What is the most common response adults give? Not a question, but a command. Don't cry. Be quiet. On the surface, these phrases appear harmless. They sound like attempts to calm the child. But inside the child's mind, a very different lesson is being learned. The child does not hear. Your emotions matter. Instead, the child learns something else entirely. They learn, my feelings are not important enough to explain. My emotions are problems that must be stopped. In that moment, the child is not being taught how to understand emotion. They are being taught how to suppress it. But emotions cannot simply disappear. A feeling that cannot move outward through language moves inward instead. It accumulates. Over time, the child discovers a strategy. If expressing emotion leads to interruption, then the safest solution is not to speak directly at all. Years later, when that child becomes an adult, a very specific pattern begins to appear. When conflict arises, they do not confront the person involved. Instead, they talk to someone else. They say things like, something happened, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to create a problem. Here, something crucial occurs. The emotion has been expressed, but it has not been expressed to the person involved. At this moment, the relationship transforms. Instead of two people, there are now three. Emotion flows from A to C, about B. This structure is known in family psychology as a social triangle. The social triangle. In a triangle, tension between two individuals is redirected through a third person. A feels hurt by B, but instead of speaking directly, A talks to C. C now becomes the emotional mediator. And suddenly the relationship is no longer simple. It becomes a network of interpretation, loyalty, and misunderstanding. It is important to understand something here. Most people who operate in this structure are not intentionally manipulative. They are not trying to create division. Quite the opposite. Direct confrontation feels terrifying to them. Why? Because early in life they learned a painful lesson. If I show my emotions directly, relationships become dangerous. So emotion searches for a safer route, a detour, and the triangle is born. The insight of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Let us return briefly to the insight from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The text explains that when a consciousness fails to recognize the true nature of its experience, it becomes trapped in repeating visions. Psychologically translated, the meaning is strikingly clear. Unrecognized emotions do not vanish. They simply return in disguised forms. A child who could not express sadness may grow into an adult who communicates through indirect complaints. A child who was not allowed to express anger may later participate in subtle alliances and divisions within social groups. The original emotion remains, but its form changes. Instead of tears, we see rumors. Instead of anger, we see passive resistance. Instead of dialogue, we see triangles. This is why, in many communities and organizations, we encounter a peculiar phenomenon. Conflicts are everywhere, yet the people involved rarely speak directly to one another. Messages circulate, interpretations multiply, and relationships fracture. What we are witnessing is not merely poor communication. It is the long echo of childhood emotional suppression. The simplest question that changes everything. If we summarize this entire pattern, it comes down to a single difference in language. When children cry, adults often say, "Don't cry." But the psychologically transformative question would be, "Why are you crying?" That single question changes the structure of emotional life because it teaches the child that feelings are not disruptions. They are signals worth understanding. When emotion is acknowledged, it does not need to disguise itself. It does not need to travel through other people. It can move directly from one person to another, and the triangle disappears, breaking the pattern as adults. Of course, by the time we recognize these patterns, childhood is already long behind us. But the essential work remains the same. The only way to dissolve the triangle is to do something surprisingly simple and surprisingly difficult. To recognize the emotions that were once silenced, to see them clearly, and then to express them directly. Not through rumors, not through intermediaries, but through honest conversation. At that moment, something profound changes. The emotion no longer needs to borrow someone else's voice. It returns to its original owner, and the structure of the relationship shifts from 3 back to 2. The ancient wisdom of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is often interpreted as a description of liberation after death. But in truth, its message is deeply relevant to the living. Liberation does not begin in another world. It begins the moment we are willing to recognize what our own minds have been repeating for years. Because the mind that is finally seen clearly no longer needs to repeat the same scene. And the relationship that once required a triangle can finally become something far simpler. 2 people speaking directly for the first time. How suppressed emotion becomes social structure. At the end of the previous discussion, we arrived at a rather unsettling insight. Many adults who appear calm, rational, and mature in their relationships are not necessarily people who have mastered their emotions. Sometimes they are people who simply learned very early in life that emotions were dangerous to express. As children, they were praised for being patient. They were rewarded for enduring discomfort. They were admired for being the one who did not cause trouble. And slowly, almost invisibly, a powerful identity formed inside them. I am the one who endures. I am the mature one. I am the one who keeps things together. At first glance, this identity seems admirable, but hidden inside it lies a psychological paradox. Because emotions do not disappear simply because we decide to endure them. They accumulate. They remain inside the mind, quiet, unresolved, and waiting. And eventually, those unspoken emotions begin to search for another way out. When endurance becomes a mask, here is the difficulty. A person who has spent years cultivating the image of being the patient one or the reasonable one cannot easily express anger anymore. To express anger would threaten the identity they built their entire life around. If they suddenly speak with frustration, they fear something deeper than conflict. They fear losing the role that defines them. So instead of expressing emotion directly, the mind begins to invent indirect pathways. And this is where something fascinating happens. Rather than confronting the person who caused the frustration, this individual begins to enter the space between other people. Instead of saying, "I am upset with you," they say things like, "Let me help resolve this. Maybe I should talk to them for you. I'll explain the situation to both sides." On the surface, this behavior looks noble. It appears diplomatic, balanced, even wise. But psychologically, something else may be happening. The person who cannot express their emotions directly begins to move relationships like pieces on a board. Their anger does not disappear. It simply changes form. Anger becomes objectivity. Resentment becomes mediation. Unspoken frustration becomes the belief that if I'm not here, this entire relationship will collapse. And before anyone realizes it, the structure of the relationship changes. It is no longer a relationship between two people. It becomes a triangle. The conflict between A and B suddenly involves C. C becomes the mediator, the translator, the emotional bridge. But inside that bridge lies the unresolved emotion that could never be spoken directly. The identity trap. This pattern is not driven by cruelty. In fact, most of the people caught in this structure genuinely believe they are helping. They feel responsible, necessary, even morally justified. But the ancient psychological insight found in the Tibetan Book of the Dead offers a profound way of understanding this phenomenon. In that text, human suffering is often described as the result of clinging to a fixed identity. When the mind becomes attached to a self-image, I am the patient one. I am the responsible one. I am the one who keeps peace. It begins to defend that identity at all costs. And the tragedy is that the identity itself becomes a prison. The person who must always be the mature one loses the freedom to simply be human. They cannot express anger. They cannot express hurt. They cannot even admit exhaustion. So the mind invents indirect strategies, not out of malice, but out of survival. When feelings lose their owner, let us consider another childhood pattern that shapes this behavior. Imagine a child who becomes angry or upset. Instead of being asked, "Why are you angry?" the child hears something very different. "That's nothing to be upset about. You're overreacting. It's not a big deal." These words may seem comforting to adults, but to the child, they carry a very powerful message. They say, your feelings are not reliable. Your emotions cannot be trusted. Someone else must decide whether what you feel is valid. At that moment, something subtle but important happens. The child does not stop feeling emotions. Instead, the child stops trusting their own interpretation of those emotions. As the years pass, this person begins to look outside themselves. Whenever they feel something uncomfortable, they ask silently, "Am I really angry? Or am I just being sensitive? Is my reaction legitimate?" Because they were never allowed to develop an internal emotional compass. They begin to rely on the reactions of others to determine what they feel. And this is where the triangle begins to appear again. If they feel uncomfortable with person A, they do not speak to A. Instead, they speak to B or C. They ask, "Did you notice how that person behaved? Doesn't that seem strange to you?" In that moment, a private emotion becomes a social investigation. The feeling no longer belongs to the individual. It spreads across the relationship network. And once again, the triangle appears. Now, personal confusion becomes social division. From the outside, this pattern can look like ordinary gossip, but psychologically, it is something deeper. It is the attempt to build an external structure that can interpret emotions. The individual cannot interpret alone. Instead of saying, "I feel hurt," the person creates a stage where others decide who is right and who is wrong. But this solution has a dangerous side effect. Two people's disagreement suddenly becomes a conflict between groups. Interpretations multiply. Alliances form. Misunderstandings grow. What began as a single emotion becomes a social fracture. And this is why societies often appear filled with tension, even when individuals rarely speak directly to one another. The real issue is not personality. It is the absence of emotional ownership, the quiet beginning of division. If we trace the origin of these patterns back far enough, we almost always find something surprisingly small. A simple sentence repeated during childhood. That's nothing to be upset about. Why are you making such a big deal? These words silence the child in the moment, but they also take away something essential: the child's authority over their own emotional experience. And without that authority, the individual grows up, searching for validation in other people's reactions. Eventually, emotions stop traveling directly between individuals. They begin to move through networks of interpretation, through intermediaries, through alliances, through triangles, seeing the structure clearly. At this point, the central question changes. Instead of asking, "Why does this person behave this way?" a deeper question appears. When did this person first lose the ability to recognize their own emotions? The moment we ask that question, our understanding of relationships begins to change. What looked like manipulation may actually be confusion. What looked like control may actually be fear. And what looked like social strategy may simply be the long echo of a childhood, where emotions were never allowed to speak directly. In the next discussion, we will examine an even more fascinating question. Why do some individuals seem to survive every conflict without ever standing in the center of it? Why do they always appear as the messenger, the mediator, or the observer, while others are left exhausted by the emotional aftermath? To understand that pattern, we must examine the deeper psychological mechanics of the ABC relational structure. If this exploration has helped you see relationships in a new light, consider subscribing and sharing this lecture with someone who might also benefit from seeing the hidden structures behind everyday conflict. Because the first step toward changing relationships is not fixing people. It is learning to recognize the patterns we have been repeating without realizing it.